I'm Dr. Dora Ann Mills, and I'm the, the Vice President for Clinical Affairs and the Director of Public Health Programs here at UNE. Thank you very much for coming today. I know you've got exams on the horizon and probably a lot of papers and things like that, so appreciate your time today. I think you will be so glad you took the time out from your busy schedules to join us today. We are so honored to have with us Regina Holliday. She is an internationally known patient advocate, and I have to share with you that I first met her last April at the Quality Counts annual conference up in Augusta at the Civic Center there. I didn't know who she was. I knew she was the keynote speaker in the afternoon, and in the morning, I saw her standing in the back of the Augusta Civic Center, and the place was packed with about 800 people, and she was standing in the very back of the Civic Center painting. And, you know, having gone to dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of medical conferences over the years, I've never seen somebody painting at a medical conference. So I thought, well, I wonder who that kind of, I mean, it's a little crazy, you know, to be painting at a medical conference. So I wonder, who's that kind of crazy lady back there painting? And I asked a couple of people, and nobody knew who she was. And then a friend of mine from the West Coast, Sue Swartz, who's a physician, she is from Maine originally, and she'd come back to Maine for that week for several business trips, business reasons, but she came back that week because she wanted to hear Regina Holliday, and she saw she was on the schedule for that afternoon. And she said to me, "Oh my gosh, you don't know who that lady is in the back painting?" And I said, "No." She said, "Let me introduce you to her." She introduced me to her, and this friend of mine from the West Coast said, she is the reason I flew back this week to Maine, because I wanted to hear her. And when we did hear her, Shelley Cohen-Conrad and Karen Perdue, there were several of us in the audience, it was transforming. You know, there had been so many articles written and talk about patient-centeredness, and I have to say, I really didn't get what it meant. And the light bulbs went off when I heard Regina talk. And it was really transforming, I think, for all of us. So we are just thrilled to have her here on campus today. And please join me in giving us a warm UNE welcome to Regina Holliday. Thank you. And I should just quickly mention, she's got a painting from this morning, from a collage from a social work class, and a painting from yesterday's medical school class down at COM. They are phenomenal. Must be very hard to see unless you're pretty close to them, but I really encourage you afterwards to come up and look at them. They're actually quite moving. So thank you, Regina.
Okay, I'm so excited to be here, and I'm going to set that down since I've got a lav on. And this is my second trip to Maine, and I'm so excited to be here. Maine has this huge warm spot in my heart, and every time I hear that there's interest in me coming up, I'm like, yay, I get to go to Maine. So I live in Washington, D.C., and I've lived there for almost 20 years, but I grew up someplace else. And this is a very tight shot of a very important painting. And oh, can you guys see the projector okay? Okay, great, because it's really important to see pictures when I speak. Okay, so this is a really big deal that we're in this space and I'm getting to speak, because it's so incredibly important. Because when I was a little child and very young, I had real trouble reading. I had trouble understanding what the teachers were saying. They would say things like, you know, A is for apple. And I'd say, got it, I got it. A is for apple, it means apple, understand. And they're like, no, 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 no. A is a sound, it can be it can be A, it can be, and I'm like, I can be very confused. And so I started drawing apple. Like, I can just draw it, and then you'll understand what I'm talking about. Well, you know, teachers don't like it when you do that. They get pretty upset. So what ended up happening is I would draw, and when they would hand me like coloring sheets where I was supposed to draw on the lines and color, I didn't do that. I would draw outside the lines, big pictures around the letter. And I eventually get sent to the principal's office for misbehaving. And you know, it's great because the principal is usually not there. Usually it's a secretary, and she gives you crayons and paper, right, to keep you busy. Yes, I was drawing some more. So by the end of my first grade year in school, I couldn't read, but I could draw a lot. And I was very happy. And so that was the way my life was going. And then I was very active, too. So I had trouble sitting still. And when I would go to church with my mom, in this beautiful space like this one, I couldn't stay in the pew. I would just be fidgeting and moving and doing all this stuff. And my mom would say, okay, you have to be still in church. You have to pay attention. So if you need to draw in order to pay attention, that's fine. But draw the sermon. Draw the things that you hear. And I did. I drew all these amazing pictures, and it really helped me to stay calm and centered and be able to stay in place. And then I had 2 sons years later. And guess what? They're just like me. They have trouble sitting still. And when my eldest child was little, I told him the same thing my mother told me. I said, okay, you have to stay still in church. So you can draw, but just draw the sermon, draw the things you hear. And one day I was sitting beside him in church and looked down at his paper, and I thought the drawing he was doing was rather odd. So he had drawn a whole bunch of little houses on the bottom of the paper, then a bunch of people like midway through the paper, and then a giant half circle on the top. And I taught preschool art for a number of years, so I knew this is an odd drawing. So I whispered to my son, I said, Freddie, what is it that you're drawing? And he said, Mommy, I'm drawing Noah's Ark from below. Whoa. Now, I don't know about you. I've seen a ton of Noah's Ark pictures in my entire life. It's always the rainbow, and there's butterflies and birds and these animals, and it's beautiful and bright. I have never seen Noah's Ark from below, right? And that was such an important part of my life to see that, because I feel like in medicine, oftentimes we're getting the rainbows and butterflies. Often when we hit websites and we look in coursework and books, we see these bright, smiley faces of patients and providers, and that's not always the whole story. There's an A story and a B story to most every encounter. And when you encounter patients within your life, you may have 5 minutes or 10 minutes of their time. You may spend a day with them, maybe 2 weeks if they have a hospitalization, and they're gone. They're a face. They're somebody who passed by. But for them, the encounter they had with you could be something they could never, ever forget and will affect them for the rest of their lives. So when I was little, I had this children's encyclopedia, and I loved it. It was from 1929. Amazing encyclopedia. And I loved it because of a couple of features it had. And one of them, it was filled with pictures. That was amazing, right? But the other thing was, it had borders. See, almost every single text article had a border inside. It was just amazing. And all these little people, and they are frantically moving in the borders, and they sort of explain the text. And it meant so much to me. And I sort of started to live within the border. I lived within the pictures since I couldn't understand the text. And by the end of my first grade year, when I couldn't read, my teachers gave me a piece of paper to bring home to my mom, and it had a bumblebee on it and a bunch of words. And I brought it home to my mom, and I said, Mom, what does this say? And my mom said, well, it says you'll be back. So I would repeat first grade. And that was really hard. And a lot of first grade was a different kind of border. So there were these balance beams along the playground that I would walk on by myself. And there were these brick walls. And beside the brick walls, we had shale deposits and sandstone and occasionally chalk. And I would pick that up, and I would draw all over these brick walls, all throughout recess, all by myself. Because all my friends had moved on. And I didn't have anyone to talk to. And I was a strange, dumb kid, right, that failed first grade. And this was my friend, the walls, and the stories that I could draw upon them. At the same time all of this was going on, my home life was really hard. And I don't know if you know the words of Edward R. Murrow, but one of the things he said was, television is the opium of the people. And I think he meant as a down comment to individuals, but I got to tell you, having a husband who had cancer, opium-based morphines aren't a bad thing. Pain can be really hard and hard to tolerate, and if television can help you through pain, that could be a good thing. But television does another thing. It educates you. So while I was in Oklahoma in the 1970s and early 80s, my husband, my future husband there, he was in Maryland. So we were distanced in this big country of ours, but we both had one thing in common, which we were watching the exact same television programs. So if you look at this painting that I did, So this painting is about all these different 1970s characters and early 80s that affected my husband and my version and view of medicine within our world. So if you look at that picture, one of the people up there is Grandma Walton. Now she was on a show called The Waltons, which was this family, and it was the 1940s, and they're famous for saying, "Good night, John Boy, good night, Sue Ellen, good night," and that's how they end every episode. But what was beautiful is watching this wonderful family that loved each other, that was kind. And one of the best elements was Grandma Walton, because she was this great grandmother. She made cookies, she loved all the grandkids, and then one day she was just gone. And I was a little kid, and she just disappeared, and I'm like, where did Grandma Walton go? And then 1 year later, she came back. Well, you see, the actress who played the part had had a massive stroke. And it took a year of rehabilitation to get to the point where she could say words at all. She still couldn't use her voice very well. But the producers of the show thought it was more important that she just not disappear, and that we understand within our society sometimes bad things happen. So she came on the show, and she could barely talk, and I was amazed, but I saw she still loved her family, and she still made cookies. And this was so important to me personally, because about 6 months later, my mother would have Bell's palsy, and she would have half of her face drop. And because she didn't like the crooked smile, she just stopped smiling altogether. But I knew, because of Grandma Walton, it was going to be all right. Then, there were some other characters. That's Quincy from Quincy M.E. And I was a little kid, and one of my favorite programs was about a medical examiner, okay? I was watching it every week. And there was this amazing episode where Jack Klugman, who played the part of Quincy, was fighting for this gentleman who had a disease like Tourette's to be able to get the drugs he needed. It was just a fictional episode in a television program. But this episode was so powerful, and it touched the masses so much that Jack Klugman testified before Congress. He was the first celebrity testifying before Congress. He packed the House, and he was testifying about the importance of the Orphan Drug Act passing, that we must have access to certain drugs so the patients in our society, be they a small, minute segment of our population, have access to the drugs they need. And the act passed. So he may have played a doctor on television, but he did an amazing thing as an actor on television. And then if you look at the painting there in the middle, that's Hawkeye Pierce from MASH. And that was my husband's favorite character. And he loved Hawkeye simply because, well, you know, he was sardonic, he was funny, and he was just this great cut-up. And on the final episode of MASH, it was 1983, it had the largest viewership in the American audience ever up until the 2010 Super Bowl, okay? That's amazing. Now, a lot of shows on the day they go out, their final episode, it's a song and dance number, right? It's fun, we go to Hawaii, somebody gets married, I mean, it's just beautiful, hurrah, everyone has a great time. Not MASH. On MASH, what we got to see is the favorite doctor that we'd had for many years have a complete nervous breakdown. And we kept getting these flashbacks, and it didn't make any sense. He was on a bus, and there were people, and the enemy was somewhere nearby, and there was this woman, and she had a chicken. And he told the woman to make her chicken shut up. And she did. And he couldn't get over this. And as the episode progressed, we realized it wasn't a chicken at all. That the woman had suffocated her own infant in her arms. And the doctor had to deal with that. A man who knew his entire mission in life was to cause no harm, caused the death of a child. And this is what they decided to deal with on the final episode, that this kind of thing happens within medicine. Then there was Incredible Hulk, right? Light-hearted, comic hero, right? If you watch the first episode of The Incredible Hulk, I was 5 when it came on. I love that show. But the first 30 minutes of that show, on the first pilot episode, is dealing with catastrophic grief. See, he was with his wife in a car, and there was an accident, and he couldn't get her out, and he couldn't lift the car, and he couldn't save her life, and the car blew up, and she died. And he was a scientist, and his job was to fix things, right? So he had to fix that. He had to find a way so that didn't have to happen. Because the entire arc of that television program was about a spouse who lost their loved one, and they're trying to make that better. But the one that meant the most to me personally was Mary Ingalls, because there was an episode of Little House on the Prairie where Mary Ingalls was doing this to the chalkboard, you can see, And she was getting close and peering. And I said, Mom, look at Mary. I'm doing everything Mary's doing, everything. I can't see the chalkboard. She said, no, you're in 4th grade. You can see. I said, no, Mom, I'm doing the things Mary's doing. I can't see that well. So we were an uninsured family, which meant that we didn't go to the doctor very often. And if you're poor, oftentimes the time of year you get your glasses is tax return time, right? Because a check comes, everybody gets the family glasses. So I knew I was going to go to the eye doctor. And I was excited about this because I'd never been to an eye doctor before. Now, I had been to a regular doctor a couple times. And what they did, and this would be when I was really sick. I mean, so sick I could barely stand. So I'd be laying down on the examination table, and the doctor would come up, and he'd look at my mouth, he'd look at my ears, he'd look at my nose, and then he'd walk over to my mom, and he'd say, Mrs. McCandless, your daughter has another tonsil infection. Here's some antibiotics. Make sure she has plenty of fluids. If she doesn't get better soon, come back in 2 weeks. And then he'd leave. Wouldn't talk to me again. Eye doctor was completely different. Oh, what happened when you go to the eye doctor? There's a special room, right? And you walk in, and there's a chair that's like a throne. And you get up on top of this chair, and they start putting all these glass slides in front of your eyes. And then they say, is this one better or this one? A or B, 1 or 2, and you're in charge the entire time. Oh, I was so happy. I'm like 10 years old, and I'm in charge during an appointment. And by the end, like 30 minutes of glass slides going by, I could see that chart, all those letters, and I was amazed. And then a week later, they sent me glasses, and I put them on, and for the first time in years and years and years, I could see leaves again. And it was beautiful. I'd forgotten what leaves look like. So I could see, and I was in 4th grade, and that was wonderful. And I had this teacher, her name was Mrs. Graham, and she figured something out when I started 4th grade. She figured out that I had dyslexia. I had a disability. That was the reason I couldn't read. That was the reason I was struggling so much. So she put me on something she called an individual education plan, or an IEP. And she told me, okay, we're going to have your own reading books, your own spelling list. We're going to get you up to the same level the rest of the class. And I would watch. The other kids in the class would get words like encyclopedia. Those are hard words, right? I get cat and sat and hat. And then if I got those words right, I got an A. I got a big letter A with a happy face right on my paper. And I was so excited because this was the first time ever I was doing well in school. And as the semester progressed, I was getting better, and we had report cards that were going to come home. And I was still reversing letters a lot, so I told my teacher that the big C and the little c were reversed on my name. And she said, are you sure? And I said, yeah, I'm pretty sure they're the other way. And so she wrote it that way. And then I brought that report card home. Well, my father was not a nice man. And when he saw that my teacher had made such a horrible mistake as to write my name incorrectly, he began writing very bad words to my teacher on the report card. And I couldn't let him do that, because she was so nice, you know. So I said, I'm sorry, but it's my fault. I told her to write it that way. Well, back in that time, we had these big, heavy resin hairbrushes that you'd brush your hair with. And I just finished brushing my hair, so it was laying right there on the table. And I watched my dad just clench his jaw and grab that hairbrush and just hit me on the side of the head with it. I had this big welt across my face. And I cried, and I grabbed my report card, and I started walking to school. And I was still crying when I got to school. And I couldn't go in the classroom because I knew I looked bad, and I was crying. And the teacher saw me in the hall, and she came out. And I explained why my face had a welt, and that this was only the most recent in a very long series of abuse. And the teacher gave me a Kleenex and told me to wash my face, and she hugged me, and then she had me come back into class. And then nothing happened. I thought maybe I haven't made myself clear, or maybe this is just the way it is. Maybe this is the way people treat their children at home. Maybe this is normal. A few weeks passed, and we had all these professional speakers come in, talk to us at school. There'd be a firefighter. He'd teach us stop, drop, and roll. And there was a dentist that taught us how to brush our teeth correctly. Well, about 3 weeks later, we had a police officer. And what the police officer did is he had these cards with hotline numbers. And he said, I want to give every one of these students in this class this hotline number card. And if ever abuse gets too bad in your household, you're to call that number on this card. And I took that card and I brought it home and I hid it in my dresser drawer on the very bottom. And I would wait until abuse got too bad so I could call it. Well, 7 years later, my dad was sitting in our kitchen spinning a gun on the kitchen table, saying he was going to kill all of us that night. And that was the point where I decided the abuse had gotten too bad, and I had to call the number. So I had a couple more years of high school, and I graduated, yay! And I went off to college, which is a really challenging place to go when you're all by yourself. And I struggled in college, as I struggled in school. And I was a second-year freshman when I met this amazing man named Frederick Allen Holliday II. See, we were both taking scenic painting course. That's the kind of class where you paint on the ground with really big paintbrushes, huge, huge paintings. And we were both procrastinators, so we would wait till the night before the project was due at 8 o'clock in the morning, and we would paint all night. So we would paint, and we would talk about, oh my goodness, everything under the sun. We talk about politics, and Metallica, and religion, and Stephen King. Because my husband and I were the hugest Stephen King fans. Actually, our first conversation we ever had was about The Stand in the Dark Tower. And this was our life. And we did this for an entire semester, and after an entire semester of pulling all-nighters with each other, we realized we were in love. We were engaged 2 months later and married within a year. And then the years passed. And my husband got a master's in film studies, and then he got a PhD in film studies with his dissertation on Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Yeah, it was really cool. And then we had 2 kids. We had Frederick Allen Holliday in 1998, and we had Isaac Holliday in 2006, and we were rolling on along. And because my husband had all these degrees, I dropped out of school, and I went into retail sales. I worked at a toy store, and I also taught preschool art, and I would do murals, whatever paid the bills, because it's challenging when you have one of your household who's trying to get all these terminal degrees. Then one year when I was working at a store, I was a clerk at a store, a local art committee wanted to do a festival in the park, and they really needed artists to show up at this event. And they knew, since I ran an art store, that I did some art, and said, could you please show up and show your work at our event? I said, you know, I am too busy. I have kids. I'm just too busy to do this. They said, no, just one painting. That's all we need. So I painted this painting, and it's based on a lecture that I had in college under a rabbi about the beginning of our world. And he explained parts of the Talmud that said that our world has been created many, many times. And every time humans messed up, humans did something wrong, and the angels would tell God, get rid of it. It's not working out. And he would. He'd destroy it. And that the world we live in today is the world that God did not destroy. That God decided, even though he knew it wasn't going to work out, that we would do wrong things, he kept us anyway. And that's what I painted about in that painting. And I stood beside it in a park and waited for someone to come up and talk to me. And it's a hot day, and the flies are buzzing by, and I'm just standing there, waiting for someone to come by. At about mid-afternoon, a woman who looked, between 5 and 6 months pregnant, walked up to me and looked at the painting, began to read the words on it, and began to cry. She said, I was just at my doctor's office, and we had that test, the test to see if something's wrong with the baby. There's something wrong with my baby. And then they just let me go. And I was driving home, and I saw this festival. And I stopped here. And I looked at your painting. And now I know it's going to be okay. There's maybe something wrong with my baby, but I love it anyway. And then she thanked me, and she walked away. And I was amazed that day that painting existed for one person. And she saw it, and it helped her in her life. And that's the power of what painting can do. But I did a lot of things, right? I would work at a retail toy store selling toys, and I taught little kids preschool art, and I do murals in the neighborhood, like children reading a book, or fairies in a tree, or dinosaurs in the kindergarten classroom, those kind of paintings, right? And that was my life. And rarely would my life intersect with advocacy, but it would occasionally. I was already dealing with the special ed system with my eldest son. I was dealing with the fact that he wasn't fitting in. They had sensory issues, and I was reading a great deal about this. And one day, there was a customer came in the toy store, and she came in for this toy. It's no good sport ring. And she wanted this toy, because she'd been told to buy it. It's a fun toy. I like it. It's really enjoyable to play with, right? And I was showing it to her, and she had this toy and a list of about 100 different toys on it. I looked at this order, and I thought, oh my goodness, this is going to be $3 grand worth of merchandise if we sell all this stuff to this woman. But I looked at the list and knew this isn't a list like you would give to somebody who has occupational therapy issues and has auditory processing issues and has sensory integration issues. It's a massive list. I said, where did you get this list? She said, oh, I'm trying to get my son, who's 4, into a private school, and he had a test. They gave you this test to get into private school, and they told me he failed, and then he needs to practice a whole year and then take it again so he can go to private school. I said, well, the scores, did they use words like scatter in the test scores? Was there a scatter in the test scores? She's like, yeah, they said that word. I said, did they tell you what that meant? No, they just said practice for a year, buy all these things, and then he'll learn. I said, when your son was 2, did he really love dinosaurs? Or maybe he played with trains all the time, knew all the trains, lined them all up, had all their names, knew all the characteristics of them. She said, yeah, he loved trains. Actually, he still does. We can't get him to stop talking about it. He's got episodes memorized. Did he like to spin wheels and stare at the wheels as they spun? Yeah, he did that too. Ma'am, do you think maybe your child has autism? And then I watched this woman in a toy store face break in front of me. And she began to cry. Yes, I do. I do, but nobody tells me. The doctor doesn't tell me that, and the school didn't tell me that, but I'm so worried. I said, I'm sorry, ma'am. Getting all the things on this list might help, but what's going to help more is finding out more about your son and his special needs. And that woman was so happy, grateful. She left with like one toy that day. But what was important was not the sale. What was important was helping the person out. What was important was having the really hard conversation. No matter who you are, having that kind of bravery to tell the truth. So, this is my job, and this is my life, and thank God I do not work as a commissioned salesperson. But in 2007, that was my family at Christmas time, and this picture exists because of Olin Mills. Thank you, Olin Mills Photography. Because I was at church at 9 o'clock at night with my whole family, and we managed to get this good a shot. And this shot is the only family portrait that we have. And this was a time frame in our lives when my husband, between the two of us, were working 6 jobs, yet we couldn't afford family insurance. We were living in Washington, D.C. My job would cover me, but it would have been $1,000 for the whole family. And we barely had money to pay for groceries after rent. We could do that. In January 2008, we had some New Year's resolutions, and they were simple things. They were things like, we wanted to have medical insurance for the whole family. And we wanted Fred to get a job in his field, because at this point he was adjuncting at 2 universities, and he was working as a video store clerk, and it was just too much. And then we wanted Freddie to get in a special needs school that dealt with children with autism. We wanted to spend more time together as a family. And we wanted to have a 2-bedroom apartment, because we were a family of 4 living in a 1-bedroom apartment, and that's really hard, especially if you have a child with modulation issues who tends to yell all the time. That was our life. And we were blessed because my husband was hired at American University. And that's his business card. He was so proud to give it to people because he got a job in his field. It was wonderful. And because he had that, we had got to spend more time together as a family. And then my son, he got into a special needs school. And then things were looking up. We thought, everything's coming true. We'll get the 2-bedroom apartment eventually. But we're getting so many of the things we hoped for. And then the bad thing was that fall, my husband was suffering from fatigue, but we chalked that up to the fact that, you know, big course load, right? And then he got diagnosed with hypertension. Now, he'd lost a lot of weight. He actually was in better shape than he'd been in years as far as weight loss. But they said that genetically you sometimes just have hypertension. So they put him on hypertension medication. Then January and February and March of 2009, that's Fred's status lines on Facebook. He was complaining about pain a lot. In January of 2009, my husband had been coughing. He had a bad cough, and his ribs hurt so bad he went to the ER. They did an x-ray and said he'd broken his ribs. And they said sometimes people cough explosively and can break their ribs. We thought this was odd because he's only 38 years old, but okay, I guess that could happen. And then he kept going back to the doctor because he hurt. And then in February, the ribs didn't matter anymore. It was the back pain, extreme lower back pain. And we'd go to the doctor and get more pain medications. By mid-March, my husband was on 4 types of pain medications, 2 types of muscle relaxants, and 4 types of laxatives. And we had no diagnosis of what was wrong. Then on March 13th, it was a Friday, and my husband hurt so bad on a Friday that I said, we need to go to the ER. See, there's this really pretty ER near where we live. It's got these couches and stained glass windows. There's a coffee shop. There's a gift shop. I knew there's a perfect place to wait, right? So we went to the pretty ER, and then we waited. And we waited, and we waited for hours until finally someone from Express Wound Care came out and said they were backed up. There was no way he was going to get an MRI or a CT scan that night. He should go home and see his doctor next week, and here's some more pain medication. The next week, I went with my husband to the doctor because I was getting very frustrated that he kept going and kept just coming back with pain medication. So I went with him, and they said, okay, you can just go right into the office. We walked right past the scales and the blood pressure cuff and everything. I said, aren't you going to weigh him? He said, oh, we don't always weigh our patients. It's like, I've never gone to a doctor that didn't weigh me. Trust me, I always feel sort of bad about it. But they said, well, we don't always do that. I'm like, well, I'm concerned because, you know, he's losing weight. I see him naked. I'm his wife, so he's losing weight pretty rapidly. And he walked into the office and he laid down on the table. And a few minutes later, the doctor came in and she had a paper chart and she was flipping it. And she said, so, Mr. Holliday, do you think maybe you're depressed? And my husband and I just looked at each other and said, depressed? Yeah, of course he's depressed. He's in excruciating pain all the time. And I'm worried it could be his kidneys. She said, no, he's got a protuberance of lumbar 5. It's not his kidneys. So he might need back surgery at some point. I said, no, I think we need an MRI. And my husband's claustrophobic. So we need something called an open MRI. And I think we need it this week. So where can we have an open MRI this week? And way outside of DC, there's this little town called Olney, Maryland. And they had an open MRI facility and was happy to have our business that week. So my husband drove way out there, and they gave him a CD that had his results on it. He drove it all the way back into his doctor's office and gave it to her. And about 5 days later, she called. Now, that day was a Tuesday, and my husband wasn't supposed to be home. He was supposed to be at work, and I was making a peanut butter and jelly sandwich for our youngest child. And he walked in the door, and his friend Michael was holding him up. See, he had gone to work that day at campus, and they make the professors park in the far parking lot and walk to class. And he had tried to walk to class. But halfway there, he couldn't make it anymore. So he just sat down on the curb in pain. And Michael found him there. And he called both of the professors in and said they weren't going to make their classes. And he got him in the car and brought him home. As he's coming in the door is when the phone rings. And it's Fred's doctor. And she says, we want you to make an appointment with an oncologist we know in the morning. Here's the phone number. And that was the end of the conversation. And I knew so little about medicine at this point, I didn't even know what an oncologist was. But we called and we made the appointment. And on March 25th, we went to the doctor, and Fred hurt so much he could barely walk. And when the doctor saw that he was barely walking, he said, why don't we admit you? We can admit you in the hospital, and that way you're going to get the best care, and it'll be easier for you, right? Because you don't have to travel all over the place. So we admitted him. And then the nurse said, we need the whole bags of meds. We need whatever he's on. And I said, oh my goodness, that's a lot of medicine. I've got to go all the way back home on a bus and a metro to get back to the house to get the bag and then bring it back, so it'll be a few hours. And they said, okay, just go back and get it. So I brought the whole bag of medicines back to the doctor and the nurse, and they looked at them all, and they just left him in his room. And I didn't know to take him home, because nobody said I'm supposed to do that. So we just left him there. And then on March 27th, I was at work, because, see, I left him there. I didn't know you don't leave patients alone in hospitals. I thought it was fine, that it's okay to do that, that they're designed to take care of people. But I left him alone, and I went to work, and I was at the toy store selling toys when my boss came up with a phone. And he said, Reggie, it's your husband. And I could just look at my boss's eyes, and I knew I didn't want to answer the phone. So I picked it up, and he said, Reggie, I'm so scared. The doctor was in my room. He says, I have tumors and growths in my abdomen, and I have a 3-centimeter tumor in my kidney, and I don't know what's going on. Can you please get here as soon as possible? And I said, okay, I'm coming. And I clicked off the phone, and my boss's wife drove me all the way to the hospital. And I got there, and I ran to his room, and I said, where is this doctor? Let's find out what's going on. And I talked to the nurses, and they said, well, he just left town. He left for medical conference. And I tried emailing him, and I would try calling him, but he didn't answer. And so for 4 days, he was gone, and I was going around the hospital trying to find someone who could answer our questions. What's diagnosis? What's prognosis? What's the treatment plan? What's going on? How has it spread? On the 4th day, an on-call oncologist came in the room because we'd had more tests, and we were waiting for some kind of answer, right? And she came in, and she just walked right up to the PCA pump and started looking at the bolus amount. And we said, what about we had extra tests. What about the other tests? And she said, you mean nobody's told you? No, has it spread? Has the cancer spread? She's like, oh, well, yeah, it's spread everywhere. It's in his lungs, it's in his bones. And that night, I got on the computer, and I figured out, based on what she said, my husband had stage 4 kidney cancer. And I knew people don't live long with stage 4 kidney cancer. So when the doctor came back in town in charge of my husband's case, he went to my husband at 7:30 rounds and said, so I understand your wife's been asking questions about this case. And my husband was a little frightened because he'd worked in food service, and he knew, you don't mess with the management because they spit in your burger, right? And so this frightened him. And he said, yes. She's been asking questions, and he said, well, if little Miss A-type personality has questions, she should come to my office hours. And I did, and this is a painting of that day. And it's realistic in detail other than the fact that I had a chair in real life. But I was emotionally kneeling, so I painted it that way. He never closed the door. He never stopped talking on the telephone. Never spun the computer screen around so I could see what he was talking about. One nurse came in and started talking about the parking lot problem with that one employee who keeps parking in the wrong space. And then the ambulance tech started talking about Miss Rosen's chemotherapy suite and whether it would be available later that day. And between all these interruptions, he's saying complicated scientific words so rapidly, I can't understand them. And I'm saying, please, could you slow down? Because I'm writing all these words down so I can research them online. He says, I don't like people who research online. I said, I'm sorry, but I don't have a background in medicine. So my only way to understand you is to research the words. He said, that's right, I have the medical degree. So in this painting, if you look on the back wall, that diploma, it says, I have the medical degree. And then off to the side, there's a beautiful picture of his family. I don't think it was done by Olin Mills. And if you look in the shadows behind that, in the shadows, it's our family. And this is the moment that's being broken apart. Now, sometimes when I've spoken, people say, oh, this is a simple problem. You had a bad doctor. If you got rid of the bad doctor, no problem. Like, oh, no, lots of bad things happen. We had an MRI that my husband went through, had a double dose of Ativan, was sent through it while feverish. They had to call me in to try to calm him down, did not ask me to remove my visitor tag, and guess what happened? Flew right into the MRI chamber. Or how about the ambulance tech? It was the first day of work. See, my husband was in excruciating pain. And the doctor came in and said, we can give you radiation for your pain. Something that'll deal with my pain? I want that. And he said, okay, you'll have radiation. Well, the next day, an ambulance tech crew comes in the room with like outside clothes on and an outside style gurney. And we say, what's going on? Are we going somewhere? They said, yeah, to radiation. We don't do that in the hospital. We didn't know we were being moved. And one of the techs, it was her first day. She wasn't really used to moving patients in my husband's condition. So instead of doing the lift over, she shoved. And she shoved his left hip. Now, if you know about the classic presentation of kidney cancer, you know the point of metastases. And the left hip is almost always impacted. So when she shoved it, he screamed in pain. And at that point is when it broke. But we wouldn't realize that for 3 more weeks. So, systems error. It's not just one person. All of this time, I'm asking for information about my husband's care. I found out there is a department called medical records, and they are required by law to give you copies of your medical record, and I want to go down there. It's in the basement of a lot of facilities. So I go down to medical records and say, I want my husband's entire complete medical record. And they say that will be 73 cents per page and a 21-day wait. I said, you're kidding me. He's in the hospital right now. Everything's on that computer. All you've got to do is push print. And they say that's just the way it is. Well, the next day, oh, pardon me. This was a point that I wanted to make about the fact that while all of this was going on and while I was trying to get my husband's medical record, we were huge Stephen King fans, right? Well, in the fall of 2009, there was a new book coming out. And it's called Under the Dome. And it was a special book that Stephen King wrote. He wrote it back in the 1970s and left it in a taxi cab, and it was lost forever, right? And then, guess what happened? He decided to rewrite the entire book. And it was going to be published in 2009, November of 2009. My husband could not wait. And I started researching kidney cancer. And I knew there was a really good chance my husband was not going to make it to fall of 2009. So I emailed the book buyer at the toy store, who emailed the publisher's rep, who emailed the marketing director for Stephen King, who emailed Stephen King, and said, can we get this man who's dying of cancer a galley copy of your book? And he said yes. So within 1 week, we had a book by an A-list author 7 months before publication, yet we still could not get a copy of the medical record in the hospital in which we were staying. And then Saturday, April 18th happened. See, on Saturdays, what I would do is I would wrap little toys for our children because it is really hard to visit somebody in the hospital, especially a parent who's very, very sick, especially if you have autism. So what we would do is we would wrap little presents, and we would hide them like Easter eggs all throughout the room, and we would make it fun. So I was wrapping presents when the doctor came in the room, and he didn't really come in the room. He was standing about as far away as that second pylon there, right beside you. And I was standing beside my husband. I was wrapping presents, and he stood there, and we had a list of questions. We had this important list of questions. We taped it to the bed, and we said, okay, we need to know when are we going to get a palliative pain consult and chemotherapy and surgery, and when are we going to get a walker so my husband can try to walk again? And the doctor said, don't worry about the questions. We've decided we're sending you home on a PCA pump. And we suddenly began to cry. We've only been here 4 weeks. You said we were going to get surgery. You said you were going to treat us. And you're just going to send us home to die? How is this going to work? We have a child with autism, and we have a 1-bedroom apartment, and our door isn't handicap accessible, so how is he coming home? And the doctor said, that'll be a question for the discharge nurse on Monday. And he left on a Saturday in a hospital. And that's when my husband, my sweet husband, who all the nurses loved, who was so kind and generous and the best professor you could ever want, he turned to me and he said, go after them, Regina. You try to get me care. Do everything you can to try to get me care. And I couldn't do anything all weekend, but I fought for access, and I fired the primary who never saw us, and my primary came on, and I found an oncology group willing to see him. I found a hospital willing to take transfer just so we could get a second opinion. And we fought for that, and it took 5 days to get a transfer, but we were finally sent with an out-of-date and incomplete medical record and transfer summary. It was 2 weeks old, which meant once Fred got to the new facility, they could provide no care other than a bed. Well, they tried to create a medical record using a phone and a fax machine. The nurse came up to me and said, we're sorry, we can't feed him because we have no dietary orders, so there's a pizzeria downstairs. So we won't see you if you go get a slice for him. And that's how he ate that night. Finally, at 12:30 at night, they had the meds back on. And the next day, I came back to the hospital, and the doctors in charge of my husband's case came up to me and said, we are sending you back to the other hospital to get his entire medical record, all films and CDs, because we need to see them. And I laughed at them. I've been trying that for weeks. They won't give it to me. And they said, well, they will this time because we're sending you as a courier. And the hospital printed out the record in an hour and a half. And I brought it back, stack about this big, to the new hospital. And they looked at it for about an hour. And then gave it back to me. And I'm like, I'm amazed. Wait, you said you needed this. You said it was important. And they said, we have nowhere to put it in our records. All we were wanting to do is look at it, right? You've got to have it. Because if you always have access to your husband's record, he's going to get the best care. And for the next 3.5 hours, I read my husband's record. And I was furious. It was filled with actionable data that had not been acted upon. It was filled with medical errors, miscommunication, and I couldn't believe it. One of the most glaring examples was within the radiology and imaging reports. See, on his first test of March 25th, it says, patient has distended bladder. And then on March 26th, and then on March 27th, and then on March 28th. Finally, on the nurse's progress reports of 4/7, it says, patient is retaining urine. The radiology report of 4/10 says, concerned, patient's bladder dangerously distended. Now, this is the radiology report, right, from the first radiology visit offsite. And that woman was a really nice woman. She came up to me and actually held me by my shoulders and shook them and said, Mrs. Holliday, I need to make sure that when your husband gets back to that hospital, they place a catheter. Because the hospital's not returning my calls, the doctor's not returning my calls, and your husband has a dangerously distended bladder. So I get back. And I explain to the nurse, I say, okay, I spoke to radiation, and they say that you need to place catheter, but there's something about my husband you need to know. He has a urinary tract stricture, which means that he's had catheter before, and you're going to need a specialist. You're going to need a urologist, because this is going to be hard. And they said, oh, we'll try. We've done catheters before. So they tried with a 16 gauge, and it wouldn't work. And they tried with a 12 gauge PEDS catheter, and it wouldn't work. And then they finally called for a urologist, and within 24 hours, we finally had catheter placed. Now, all along this entire time, it is said for 14 days in his medical record that he needs a catheter. And no one's reading it. I went out to the nurses in the hallway and said, look at this. Who reads this entire report? And they said, no one. We read maybe the face sheet or most recent report, but no one reads the entire document of care. I said, well, patients and caregivers need to be able to access this because we would. And so what I did is I painted Based on the nutrition facts label, a simple anatomical drawing of the important parts of the body when you're impacted by care, like where are the metastases, where are the bone mets, where are the breaks, is this person on a PCA pump, is this person incontinent, all in a simple visual that you can glance at. And then put beside it the vitals and statistics, what medicines they're on, really clear and crisp. And I showed it to nurses, and they said, this is great. We would love this on our face sheet. But then I didn't stop there. I didn't leave it in the record. Instead, I painted it as a 5x6 mural in a local delicatessen. And when I was painting it, I said, are you sure you want a picture of end-stage cancer right next to a menu? And they said yes. And it was an amazing day. At that hospital, we kept asking about chemotherapy because it had never come. We'd been asking for it for about 6 weeks. And we found out what had happened at the second facility as they actually kicked out the order. See, the chemotherapy drug was too expensive. So the pharmacy didn't order it. The only way for us to get chemotherapy in my husband's case was us ordering it from a pharmacy, a specialty pharmacy, having it sent to my apartment building, having a concierge sign for it, and then me picking it up and bringing it to the hospital. And that's what we had to do. It was $40,000 for 28 pills. And that's a piece of art with the remaining 17 pills that I priced at $24,000 based on the content and not the art. And that's the kind of thing that patients are having to deal with. Meanwhile, we were using Facebook as a caring bridge. We were using it to talk to all the people. I said, if you know me, friend me. I will tell you everything that's happening in my husband's care. And it's amazing the friends we made in those days, and they're still our friends today. And at the same time, another amazing thing happened. When my husband was sick and we were in rehab, I was doing 10-hour shifts at the hospital rehab center because the ratio of caregiver to patients was about 1 to 20. And my husband's bedridden and incontinent. So I had to be there most of the time to make sure he was cared for. And it gets to you after a while. So for 3 days, I worked at the toy store while my husband was sick. I called them sanity shifts, just to be normal for a day. And I went into the toy store, and one day, an old customer of mine was there, and I just felt I had to tell her my husband had kidney cancer. And I went up to her and said, I said, Christine, my husband has kidney cancer. And she said, oh my goodness, I met this man. He's named Impatient Dave. Dave DeBroncar. I just met him at an event. And he had stage 4 kidney cancer, and he lived. He lived? I've got to meet this Impatient Dave. What did he do to live? How do I meet him? She says, you get on Twitter. I'm like, I don't know the Twitter. And she said, well, you're going to have to learn tonight. And so that night, with the help of my 10-year-old autistic son, I figured out how to tweet. And that was my first tweet. I am trying to talk to Christine Kraft and Impatient Dave. And guess what? Within a day, he was tweeting at me, emailing to me. By that night, he had managed to get his doctor, an oncologist in Boston, Massachusetts, to call me at home. We had the most amazing conversation. I told him all about metastases and what we tried so far and the entire care protocol that we had been through, and then I waited. And so many doctors, when I'd done this before, like friends of the family, the doctors currently caring for Fred, they didn't have much to say. Friends of the family would say things like, oh, I'd really have to see him to make a decision. What Dave's doctor did was really brave. He said, sometimes it's too late. Sometimes no matter what we do, we caught this too late. And the best thing we can do is give a person the opportunity to spend the end of their life in the way that they wish. So this is the conversation I had to have with my husband. Are we going to go to hospice? We go to nursing home or we go to hospice, but I've been to both, hun. And they're so nice at hospice. I think you'd really like it there. He said, so I've agreed to die. You hurt so much, and they take care of your pain. And the EMTs came. The EMTs knew Fred by now because they'd been taking him to radiation so much. And they were crying because they watched how he failed so fast at rehab. He was doing so poorly, so quickly. And we took him into hospice, and we rolled him in the room and put him in the bed. And the nurses came in to take the history, and they said, Mrs. Holliday, you can wait out in the hallway. I said, no, I will not. I will wait in the corner, but I will not leave my husband. And then he started asking him questions he couldn't answer. And she said, just why are you asking me? You need to ask her. She's got the binder. She knows everything that's going on. And then I got to speak to the palliative doctor at hospice, and he told me something amazing. He said, your husband's pain is not managed. I bet within 24 hours we're going to see a major turnaround when we get this pain under control. And it was amazing. 24 hours later, he could almost sit up, he could smile, he could talk, he could eat again, all because his pain was in check. And for 3 weeks, we had the most amazing care at hospice. And then the discharge nurse came to us and said, well, your husband's stable, which means that we need to send him home. I said, well, but my eldest child has autism, and we don't live in a handicap-accessible apartment, and it's only a 1-bedroom, so how are we going to make that work? And she said, well, have you thought about moving? So we got an apartment that was handicap accessible. It was a 2-bedroom, and due to Facebook and another site called Lots of Helping Hands, we managed to coordinate 20 people who'd help us move in about 24 hours. And Fred got to come home. And that is how we got our last New Year's resolution, our 2-bedroom apartment. And for 6 days, I was his primary caregiver. I was the person in charge of the medical administration record that I had been denied access to for so many weeks. And on the last day, on the 16th of June, at 12:30 at night, he called out. He said, Reggie, my catheter blew. I'm like, it's okay, I'll call the hospice nurse. And I called her, and she came, and she placed catheter, and he said, you are so good at that. And she said, yeah, I worked at the VA. And then she started to sweep our floor. And I was like, you don't have to sweep our floor. She said, you know, you go be with your husband right now. And she left. And then my husband, who'd been sleeping a lot, woke up. I mean, he was talking. And I hadn't heard the term terminal restlessness. I just knew my husband was talking again. And we were pulling an all-nighter. And we talked about everything under the sun. We talked about John Colbert and Jon Stewart and Stephen Colbert and Stephen King. And he started talking about people he knew in first grade, but that was okay, because it still was talking. Then at 6:30 in the morning, my husband turned to me and said, Reggie, you look so tired. You should go to sleep. And I did, and I slept 1 hour. And then I got up for 7:30 meds, because he was really adherent. He always took his drugs on time. And so I got his pills ready and the water ready, and I said, here, honey, here's your water and your pills. You need to wake up and have your water and your pills. And he wouldn't wake up. So I crushed up the pills with a pill crusher, and I brought him back, and I put him in his mouth, and I gave him the water. I said, just suck the water, and you can take your pills. And he did. He managed to take them. But he never woke up again. And a few hours later, his breathing had gotten so slow, and there were so many pauses between breaths, that I grabbed the children up, and we went beside his bed, and we said, Daddy, it's okay. You can go. We love you so much. But you can go. And he stopped. My friends took the children out, and the hospice nurse came, and she asked what I'd like to help prepare the body. And I got to hold him. And he was still warm. And I hadn't hugged him in 2 months at that point, and I got to hold him once again. And then they came with a bag, and they wrapped him up, and they took him away. And then our 3-year-old son came back to the playground, and he saw my husband's stuffed animals all lined up that people had given him. He said, oh no, Daddy forgot his bunny. And I said, it's okay, we'll put it in his coffin, and he'll sleep with him. And that's what we did. And so we had a funeral, and we had a memorial service. And 5 days later, I began to paint on Connecticut Avenue about my husband's medical journey. And I will tell you, it was an amazing and powerful thing. If you've never done street painting before, the people you meet on the street are delightful individuals. See, if you're a young widow, which is what I was, there's this amazing thing happen, which is it must be contagious, right? Maybe somebody else's spouse must die if they talk to you. Or maybe people just don't understand, and they just don't want to say anything. but all of a sudden no one's talking to you. Well, on the street, when you're painting, first the homeless people come. First the homeless people tell you their stories. And then after you paint for days and days and days and you become normal, regular people come up and start telling you their stories. And I began to paint every day. And finally painted this painting. It's called 73 Cents. It's about 20 by 50 feet on Connecticut Avenue in Washington, D.C. And it's all my husband's journey. And if you look at all these characters in this painting, not one of them is making eye contact with another. Because that's what we experienced, a lack of communication and care. But while I was painting this, hundreds of people came up to me and told me their story of their care. And I realized we have to change things in this nation. On October 20th, we dedicated the mural. There was about 40 to 60 of us in the parking lot. We sang the songs from the Buffy the Vampire Slayer, the musical. That was how we dedicated it. It was great. And one of the things that you sing in that is, where do we go from here? And that is my question to you today. Where do we go? See, I met all those people when Fred was sick. They work in what's called Health 2.0, Web 2.0, the new future of medicine. And they asked me, what was the worst thing that happened while your husband was ill? I said, the worst thing that happened was a lack of data access, a lack of access to the medical record. See, we're in a time of change right now with electronic medical records, and it's sort of like that, scary. So we're on a burning platform, right? And that boat there, it's called the HMS Old Way of Doing Business. And the boat there in the water, that's the HCAPS boat. That's patient satisfaction scores. That's value-based pricing. And so there's like a CEO and a patient throwing a life raft for that medical provider. See, we all have to work together to make the future of medicine work. That painting, that's a painting about a piece of legislation called high tech and an element of it called meaningful use. And the idea that being electronic medical record, having in your facility is not good enough. The medical record itself has to be meaningful. It has to transfer not only clinician to clinician, but also patient. And so I painted it as a diner, right? That's what regular people are used to. And I painted Kathleen Sebelius pouring coffee because she's pouring stimulus into this problem. And there's all these cores of apples in the back. That's the core elements of meaningful use. So that's a visual allegory of what's the future. And I spoke about this a great deal and testified before a subcommittee on meaningful use. And then on July 13th of 2010, I was on stage with Kathleen Sebelius and Don Berwick and David Blumenthal and Regina Benjamin, and we were presenting this vision of the future of medicine, that patients had to be part of the solution. And then 1 year later, this was a meeting at HHS again, but this was about, they'd opened an office of consumer engagement, that patients being part of the solution was so important, they must have an entire division enforcing that fact. And see all the patients so happy and the balloons going to the sky, that's letting us be part of the solution. And that's the reason we talk about the meaning of I and HIT. It's us, it's you, it's me, it's my son. See, there are individuals and organizations who are fighting this right now. I had this painting, we come in pieces, right? Because the pharma is separate from the hospital, which is separate from the medical record in so many facilities. We have to combine them. Those patients, they've got cell phones and smartphones, because I will tell you, if patients don't have direct access, they're going to find other ways. That gentleman is Dr. David Shear, and he's a big proponent of the idea that people who have implanted medical devices should be able to access information from that device. Currently, if you have an implanted device, it's sent to the doctor in charge of your care, it's sent to the vendor who owns the product, you are not allowed to see it. But people like Hugo Campos and other empowered patients, they want to see that data because they actually want to change their life and their style of life based on the results of real-time data. In Bellin Health in Green Bay, Wisconsin, they did an amazing thing. They had a stroke program. It's considered one of the best stroke programs in Wisconsin. And the director, the CEO, who actually had once upon a time been the director of housekeeping, he had a question for the staff. He said to the stroke team, how are our patients doing a year and a half out? And they all looked at each other. We don't know. We've never asked how they're doing a year and a half out. He said, I want to know. Call them up. So they start calling people on the phone. And they called someone called Betty Bundy. And they said, hi, Betty. Is this Betty Bundy? And she said, yeah. Oh, we're the folks at Bellin Health. She said, oh, Bellin, you suck. You almost killed me. I was there 3 times in 3 days, and you lost my medical records every single time, and I just got worse, and I had a stroke because of you. Now, a lot of hospitals, they hear this conversation, they're just walking back slowly, right? But what Belen did was they invited her to the hospital for a full meeting like this one with all the staff. They want to hear exactly what Betty had to say, and I will tell you, if you ever meet Betty, she says it the way it is. There's no filter there. And what they decided to do was they were rolling out a brand new electronic medical record system. They named it Betty. They named it and they put her face on it and everything. And so now when people get angry and they're implementing a system, you know, they don't say, wah, wah, wah. They don't say, I can't stand this Betty. No. They actually love Betty. Betty's great. And it's changed their perception of a rollout. But not only did they do that, they got a huge room. They set up all these tables working on EMR workflows and had a patient at every single table. Can you imagine that? The entire system utilized patient participation and an EMR workflow design. That's beautiful. I worked with a group in Washington, D.C. called the Learning Health System. It's amazing. It's chaotic thought, chaos with order. And the idea within the Learning Health System would be, how about people working in the government, people working in private practice, research scientists, patient communities, all got together and decided to have a cooperative agreement to share information within a large network. What if we did that? What if we took the islands of excellence and care throughout this nation and spread them wide and far? And it's amazing. And all these people are starting to work together and share data that in the past was only sold. And then there's the Open Notes Project. Robert Wood Johnson Foundation has been working for 2 years on a project to prove that if patients could read their doctor's notes, it would provide better care. And the results have now come out, and it's absolutely amazing. So 90% of the patients that responded said they understood what they read. Yes! Because one of the #1 things people said, oh, patients, you know, they don't understand this stuff. It's too complicated. So we can't let them read it. Or only 1 to 2% were concerned or offended by the notes, because there are people who said, you know, morbid obesity. All those people were angry at us. We can't have that. They can't read it. 87% of the patients who enrolled in this did check their notes, which was a big deal because people said, patients will never bother to actually look. The doctor said it caused negligible workflow issues, almost none. Pretty much all the doctors who did the study are actually continuing the practice post-study. And 80% of patients who were participating in the study said it actually affected their medical adherence in a positive way and their understanding of doctor's orders, which is spectacular. Now imagine if we opened it up more. Beth Israel Deaconess Hospital enjoyed this study so much, they've decided by 2013, they're going to open the entire facility's notes up to all. Isn't that amazing? All these patients here in this painting, there's 17 of them. They all had harm. They all had to fight the system. They all had to do something to save their lives. And they wrote books. Every single one wrote a book. And I got to tell you, if you research these books, which are how to survive your hospital stay, basically, I could make a painting that started here and ringed this entire room and went all the way around and met in the middle. And that's how many books there are on this subject. But books are not an aggregation of data. They're often a silo in and of themselves. So the federal government and AHRQ and some other organizations are all working together right now to create a hotline number. Someone you can call, a website you can go to report harm when the abuse becomes too bad. That's a 20 cue ball. It's a toy we sold at the toy store. Anybody play with a 20 cue ball? I know some of you have. Yes, yes. Okay, it rocks, right? So it's this ball loaded with a mathematical logarithm, autotaxonomy, and a dictionary. And you think of any word in your mind, and within 20 questions, it almost always gets it. I'm talking everything, like the echidna, the living relative of the marsupials. It's like, my friend did that, and it got it. You know? So as long as you answer the questions honestly, it gets the answer. And I will tell you, the original design of that ball, it always got the right answer. But they found out human beings don't like to lose every time. So they tweaked the code, and you occasionally get to win now. So imagine if that kind of technology was applied to triage in the ER. Imagine when my husband was waiting for 3 hours, it asked questions like, do you have blood in your urine? Do you have night sweats? Do you have bone pain? Do you have hypertension? Do you have fatigue? Imagine and ask the kind of questions that would have shot off to the doctor. This patient may be a zebra. This patient may have cancer. Imagine that world. This is my son after a doctor's appointment. See all the toys behind him? Because who taught you how to be a patient, right? Who taught you your toys, probably? They taught you to sit there and somebody else does everything to you. Well, he went to a doctor's appointment at a clinic where the secretary, the receptionist, handed him a netbook and said, start building your medical record. And he did. He started typing his name and his age. That's about all he could type because he's little. But we had this great conversation about what we should put in his medical record. And then we pushed send. And then we tried to give the netbook back. And she said, you don't have to give it back. You already pushed send. We have it. You can just keep the netbook, all the appointment, and surf the internet. And so that's what he did. Started studying snakes. And then we went into the eye appointment that he was going to have because he thought he had conjunctivitis. And the doctor said, you have pink eye, also known as conjunctivitis. Do you want to Google that and we could show you what it looks like? And they did. And my son loved it. It was a great appointment. And then 1 month later, we had a regular appointment with Kaiser Permanente, our regular checkup doctor. And she was typing at the computer with her back facing us, and he's sitting up on top of the table, and I see him. He's getting that impatient look in his eye. And he jumps, and he goes right up to her and says, when is it my turn to type? So that's the kind of participation we're going to see in the future. And then there's the walking gallery, right? See, my sons are part of the walking gallery. They both designed jackets of their own. When my son was in the hospital, he saw the pain chart. And he said, Mommy, that's horrible. Because you know, in autism school, they actually study faces. They memorize faces to learn how people respond to things. And he said, that is not how people look. And so I made my own pain chart with my husband and myself, showing the real faces of pain. Because you need to look at us to see how we hurt. And that's my son in the big mural. See, he's an eye in a door crack. Because that's how welcome he thought he was in the medical environment. And this is the painting he had me paint for him. He said, Mommy, what I want to wear in the gallery is I want you to paint visitor parking. And I want you to paint a big skull on top of visitor parking. And I want you to put coins falling out of its mouth. Because it is wrong to make a person pay to park while they watch their daddy die. And that's my little son, Isaac. He painted his own jacket. He joined the gallery with his own story that he wanted to paint himself. And then he's marching, saying, I am a patient too. And he remembers his daddy, and he loves him. And he's going on with his life. And then there's me. I'm little Miss A-type personality, right? See, this kind of painting is called painting in negative space. I did not paint the letter A. I painted the world around it. You can take a negative and you can turn it into a positive. At this point, there are 188 people walking all over the nation in jackets like this. They walk to medical events like this. And because there's a painting on their back, they tell their most personal story. And they're providers, they're patients, they're clinicians, they're researchers. But they're spreading the word of what truly being patient-centered means. We had a gathering in Washington, D.C., and that was Daniel Cass and her parents' story. See, they're both doctors, both of them. And both of them got diagnosed with cancer. And that jacket's called The Forest for the Trees. Because they didn't know until they hit the system. They didn't know what it felt like to be a patient and how frightening and scary and confusing it is. This painting I did recently, and it's for partnership with patients. See, there's a CMS campaign called Partnership for Patients. It's trying to reduce harm in readmissions. And they didn't invite patients to the table for the first, year of the program. And when they finally invited us to the table, there was no money to bring us. So they said we could have some web conference calls. I said, well, I think we could have a conference and invite you. So using tools of social media like Twitter and Facebook and brand new crowdsourcing and crowdfunding models like MedStarter and Health Tech Hatch, we raised money to have a conference in Kansas City and invited CMS. And they came. And we had about 70 people there, an equal mix of patients and providers. We had an amazing conversation. And why there's a cinder block in that picture is because of a story I told that crowd, which was, we can make something beautiful with what we have. See, when I was in 5th grade, we had no bookshelves. And my teacher, what she did was she called the local lumber yard and said, could we get some bookshelves? Could we get some cinder blocks and 2x4s to make them? And the lumber yard said, yes, but you'll have to pick them up yourself. Now, I think they thought we would bring a pickup truck and do that, right? She had a field trip instead. So the entire 5th grade class walked to the lumber yard and carried 2x4s and cinder blocks all the way back to school. And we set up our own bookshelves. And they might not be pretty, but they were ours. And we felt so proud. And that's what I wanted patients and providers to grasp. We can build something beautiful together. And what I would like to close with today is a poem. And it sort of wraps everything up. It's called The Writing on the Wall. When I was only 6 years old, I drew upon the wall. So sad, so small, and all alone, I smote my cares on stone. The other children ran and skipped, like ants they'd come and go. But I stood silent, chalk in hand, and drew upon a wall. The teachers, they would pass me by and talk amongst themselves. The other children ran and laughed and played and left me to myself. And I would sculpt and scratch and draw. The art would soothe my soul. And I left the best part of me as powder on a wall. At 7 years, I'd learned that walls are hollow things, that fathers beat and children greet whips with tears and screams, that gentle souls can't help but bow before the rage, that walls give way to fists and boots, and drywall cracks with age. I took my sorrow and wrote it on a page and dropped it in the wall, hoping it would speak for me if I could speak no more. 7 years old I may be, and slow and sad and small, but even I could see the writing on the wall. At 7 years and 30, I'd find the wall again. I'd remember in my sorrow that bricks can be your friends, that cinder blocks and stones can call, that paint can make amends. So I painted all my grief out and I smeared it on a wall. And the children watched in wonder and the world would hear my call. Sometimes within our sorrow, sometimes in grief and pain, you can write your testament in gigabytes and paint. When I was only 6 years old, I drew upon a wall. So sad, so small, and all alone, I smote my cares on stone. But I no longer paint alone. The world has heard my call. Thank God, each night I log on, and my friends see the writing on my wall. Thank you. I can take questions if anybody has any. There's one over there.
I just wanted to say that I'm patient about this ridiculous, and for years I've worked with my dogs and caregivers with the medical records, the electronic, and sit down at the table with the monitor and, can you hear me now? And share my medical records. So that's, I mean, we're talking early 1990s. Tom Del Banco did, you know, Through the Patient's Eyes. And at BID, they also have heart-to-heart, patient-to-patient, so that they hook you up with patients. It's a wonderful program.
Yeah. The major difference is now they're rolling out to the entire facility. Because before, that was a decision that your team made. It wasn't required. Now it is. So it's a beautiful thing that's happening. And the painting that I did on that slide, now Tom owns that painting. And it was amazing at the open notes thing where Tom was speaking, I had painted musical notes onto the painting, the whole note, you know, the open note. And I said at the end while I was describing the painting that this is whole notes or open notes. And he said, you know what? All of us who put the study together are also musicians. And they really are. They're open notes. And so just an amazing man.
Wow.
Questions?
Any other questions or comments?
What's your next step?
Well, right now we're working on a survey that we're putting together about defining patients and also what are the major issues or agendas that people want to hit in the next year. And we're using TraitWise, which is the best survey company I've ever seen. TraitWise, Amazing. Because, you know, like SurveyMonkey, you just do it and you fill in the fields right and you never get no feedback other than, thank you for taking our survey. What happens with TraitWise is when you answer, the minute you answer, it shows a spread of everybody else who's answered that question and where you fall within the spread. It's astounding. So we're working with them to create the survey because the next step is figuring out what's a national patient agenda for what are the 3 things that we can really do to reduce readmissions and reduce hospital-acquired conditions and infections.
You know, with so much emphasis on patient safety, which I think is needed, it also astounds me that if you do a lot of things in life, if you travel, you go to TripAdvisor for other people's input and advice. If you go to a town you've never been to and you want to eat out, you go to Zagat. If you, I mean, you can just Google just about anything and find out what other people think of it. But when it comes to healthcare, it's amazing how, to me, how we don't have such a system, and that, you know, whether even little things like, actually these are huge things, but I have a relative who just had a stem cell transplant in Boston, had one in Pennsylvania last year. So it's unusual for somebody to have such a procedure in 2 different hospitals. And she's been blogging about the differences and how the hospital she's in now, you can order food 24 hours a day. And the other hospital, you had to order ahead of time, the day before, all your meals for the next day. If you're going through a stem cell transplant, you have no idea what you're gonna wanna eat a day later. Things like that. And it's like, and I've been telling her, I said, gee, you know, this is almost like the start of a TripAdvisor for hospitals. Is there any such a movement? I mean, it just seems like it's so needed. Not just, because I know there's a lot of rankings now, Leapfrog and others are doing on patient safety and very objective data, and that's great. But what about just the other types of experiences that can be just as important?
Yeah, it's been a problem. If you try to do a lot of those rate your med, doctor kind of things, in prior years, what was really scary is a disclaimer would pop up that if you said anything that was libelous or slanderous in this site, they would sue you, which really frightened people, even myself. I'm an advocate, right? And I wouldn't put anything on those for a whole year because of that disclaimer. So it's like, I don't want to have to deal with a lawsuit just for complaining, you know? So it's starting to get better. There's starting to be a little bit more openness, like sometimes on Angie's List and other sites, you're starting to see comments. But there's no national aggregate. ProPublica is one of the ones working on it. So ProPublica just did a patient survey that they want to go in a new direction trying to create something like that. So that's pretty exciting, and I would highly recommend you look at what ProPublica is doing, because they've opened a lot of stuff up. The patient harm site that's going to go live in 2013, it will have some of that, you know, and with HCAHPS data becoming more and more hospitalcompare.gov, you can get a lot of ideas from that. But there's people at ARC working on making more tailored questions that gets better results. And also the question is, right now, all those surveys are turned in by snail mail, right? So how much of the population are we missing in survey response based on the only way we're taking it is snail mail? So as we get deeper into more of a technological driven survey system, I think we're gonna get much, much better response times.
Have you seen a difference with how, depending on where you are in the country, how doctors treat their patients or their patients' families, or kind of the morale depending on where you are?
Well, it can be challenging because also we have people from many, many nations treating people throughout the entire country. So it's not just regional, sometimes it's cultural too that you've got to deal with. But there are some regional tendencies. Like when I speak in South Dakota, people are really amazed by a lot of stuff I have to say because they don't see it very often. And being that there's not a giant outspoken patient advocacy committee and patients coming out of that state, I got to think anecdotally that there's not the huge harm that we see sometimes in other places. So it is regional. There are elements that are nationwide though. And when it comes to hospital-acquired conditions and infections, that's pretty bad all over the place. So it's underreported. It's extremely underreported. So we've got to figure out ways to have this reporting go up. Was there anybody else?
One more question. Do you know if there are any other countries that have a system that you think works? well for
It's
patients?
challenging. Denmark's got a really good one, but you've got also nationalized medicine and patient identification numbers. It's like in Denmark, everybody's got a number, right? So everybody has a record. And within that system, they have it where the patients always have access to their data. And if anybody gets into their record, they are notified. Yeah. So nobody's ever supposed to go into a patient record that's not actually dealing with that patient. So it's a pretty amazing system, but it's, it's Denmark, relatively small population. In Australia, they're also working right now on a nationwide electronic medical record. They're still in the beginning stages, and at this point, it's pretty much just their blue book. So it's the immunization records of the entire country becoming available online. So we're at this amazing growth phase where every country is trying to figure this out. And we're all just stealing from each other to figure out the best model. There was one element I didn't put in this speech. I unfortunately didn't include a slide on Blue Button. I don't know if you've heard of what they're doing within Blue Button, but the VA had a system that came out 2 years ago, which was the idea of an ASCII file data dump. So it's not the cleanest looking data, but it's data, it's your information. And it could be a year to 3 years worth of data that's in your dump. And it was available to all people in the VA. And then they spread it out to TRICARE and Medicare. And there was a White House meeting in June that I went to that in that meeting we started talking about spreading it out to the private sector. So United Healthcare was interested, and IPEC was interested, and a few other organizations were interested in getting Blue Button also. And if that happens, that sidesteps a lot of the stuff I was talking about and goes straight to a patient getting a data dump, which is free. The idea being that a lot of people are just trying to get this information, they can get their disability, or they can provide good care as they transfer to another physician. So that's another option to get data.
I just also wanted to point out that in the Danish example, in public health, for those of you maybe interested or are studying public health, Denmark and Sweden and Norway, those with electronic medical record systems for the whole country, they are used tremendously to detect public health issues. So for instance, this whole question, do cell phones cause brain cancer? Those answers are coming out of Denmark and Sweden because they have nationwide systems. And so it's not just the individual patient who may benefit, but we as society can also benefit from having these types of systems.
And there's also the idea of data sharing. So HIPAA regulation, a lot of people get really confused about this. As a patient, your HIPAA rights, or you can share it with whoever you please, because it's yours once you have it, right? So that's patient view HIPAA. So there's a whole bunch of patients who've done what are called HIPAA releases. So I have released my data to Kaiser Permanente, my provider, to do with it as they will in a public forum. They can speak about me. I'm fine with that. I want people to know. And there's a whole bunch of people who are like that. And there's even a movement that when you go to the DMV and say you want to be an organ donor, there's a push a lot of us are pushing for, which is, do you want to be a data donor? Would you like to release all your data upon your death to allow for the kind of national aggregation that she's speaking of? Because we can't get to true evidence-based medicine until we get to these really beautiful large aggregation, and that will change a lot of things. Cool.
Well, thank you
Thank you
very,
so much.
very much.
That's great.
Thank you for coming.